Hi, welcome everyone. I would like to welcome Elizabeth Murrin, a senior statistician at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, for our next presentation. She will be discussing a number of topics using design of experiments and functional data analysis through surrogate modeling of computational fluid dynamics simulations. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see my slides. Perfect. All right, so my name is Elizabeth Murrin, as Joe said, statistician here at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. Catherine Chalakian is a data scientist here at APL as well, and so we're going to kind of tag team and present on some of the work that we've been doing on functional data analysis, specifically developing a surrogate model for a physics-based model here at APL. So internally, APL developed a physics-based modeling and simulation suite that simulates the performance of a particular system. For this physics-based model, there are dozens of inputs and output variables. And when you vary each of those different input variables and you try to run a particular test case, it can take several minutes to run. So in order to simplify model usage, reduce runtime, and allow opportunity for us to be able to share this model with other organizations, we wanted to look into developing a surrogate model. So the goal of this effort was to do three things. First, we wanted to explore a robust down selection of critical input parameters so that we're covering the entire analysis space. Two, we also wanted to leverage functional data analysis so that we could look at the entire transient profile curves for those input parameters. And then also we lastly wanted to quantify some of the uncertainty. Since we have our physics-based model and there's some already known uncertainty that could be built into that model because it's supposed to model real test data, by introducing a surrogate model, we wanted to see if there's any error or uncertainty when we go from surrogate model to a physics-based model and then ultimately back to our real test data. So the first step then is using design of experiments. So DOE is a systematic and structured approach used in statistics to plan, conduct, and analyze tests so that we can gather information and draw conclusions. For our particular analysis, what we want to do is leverage DOE so that we can identify input parameters that seem to most significantly affect our surrogate or our physics-based model so that we can include them in our surrogate model generation. So there's multiple components to DOE. So you have your different factors. Those are those different input variables that we want to consider. And then each of those variables can take on various levels. And then ultimately, we want to come up with our experimental design or our test matrix. So this is how our data is going to be sampled, and we provide it to our engineers so they can put those input variables in the particular order into their physics-based model, and that'll ensure that we get full representation and sufficient coverage. Since our physics-based model is a computer experiment and it therefore has a deterministic response, we end up leveraging a space-filling design, and I'll go through that more next. So typically space-filling designs are used for computer experiments. There was 4 particular space-filling designs that we considered. We have a table shown here that shows the advantages and disadvantages of each type of designs. We have sphere packing, uniform design, Latin hypercube, and the fast flexible filling. When we are working with our engineers to identify various input parameters that would go into our model, not all of those variables and factors were necessarily continuous. We had some variables that actually were categorical. So when we look at some of the disadvantages for sphere packing, uniform design, and Latin hypercube, you can see that you need all of your factors to be continuous to use those particular designs. So that's how we ended up coming up with the fast, flexible filling design. Since we did have some really critical input parameters that were categorical, we wanted to be able to include those. So that's why we ended up leveraging the fast, flexible filling design, because it accounts for categorical variables as well. So just the DOE execution plan, our first step, I had kind of mentioned already, was working with those engineers to identify a list of input and output variables that we want to be able to look at for this study. And then the second step is determining how many runs we want to do for our DOE analysis. We end up varying our run size because we wanted to figure out what the optimal number of runs would be for our analysis. So if you look at the plot on the top right, you can see the different sample sizes across your x-axis, and then we used a discrepancy metric on the y-axis there to be able to see how evenly spaced our design points are. So a smaller discrepancy is going to indicate a more uniformly spaced design. So you can see if we ran, say, 200 or 300 or so samples for our DOE, our discrepancy is quite large. And then as we increase our sample size after that, till we get to about 750, 800, 1,000, it seems to be the bend in the curve, and it starts to level off. So when we talked with our engineers, we ended up settling on 1,000 runs using that fast, flexible space filling design. So we had our engineers go ahead and run the physics-based model using that 1,000 run test matrix, and then they passed back the results to us. So then we were able to evaluate the relationship between our input variables and then also our output parameters. And then what we did was use variable selection strategies to help down select and remove any parameters that we thought were insignificant. And we did that both with those strategies and working with our engineers as well, since they have a really good insight on what parameters they thought would be really important and would need to include. So based on those conversations and that variable selection strategy, we started out with a total of 12 input parameters, and we ended up getting it down to 9 variables that we found to have the most impact for our physics-based model. So then we ultimately came up with 1,000 test run matrix developed with those 9 critical input variables. So just an overview of functional data analysis. So functions are typically over time, especially when you're looking at modeling and simulation like we are. Normally, our engineers will go ahead and pick off certain points of interest for their particular time curve. They call them point parameters. And then they just use traditional statistical methods to do any comparisons. But you may be missing some information because you're not necessarily looking at the entire time curve. So what we explored was functional data analysis methods so that we could evaluate that entire time curve, and then maybe we could get additional insights that were being lost by just picking off points on our curve. Functional data can be interesting in many ways, including forecasting, DOE outputs, and as inputs into other predictive models. JUMP is a type of statistical software, and it provides an opportunity for us to do functional data analysis and tie things back to our design of experiments called FDOE. Here, we're using our design of experiment factors to predict our response. So think those time curves or transient profile curves. And then we use functional principal component analysis, FPCA, to break down our data into functional principal component scores and eigenfunctions. So the FPC scores are going to explain the function-to-function variation, and then our eigenfunctions are going to explain our time variation. And then we're able to perform statistical analysis with those FPC scores so that we can determine if there's any statistical differences or equivalence between our test data and then our physics-based modeling and simulation. So this is a flow chart of our general process. So you start with the data acquisition phase. We did this already when we had our design of experiments. So we essentially designed how many test runs we wanted to do. We ran our experiments. We ran it into our physics-based model. We loaded and organized our data into our tool JUMP. And then we move next into the data processing phase. Within JUMP, there is an option in their functional data explorer to do any cleaning of our data. We didn't necessarily need to do this, but if you had say anomalies, outliers, negative values, anything that you needed to do any cleaning of your data, there's an opportunity to do that within the tool there. I'm going to focus on the last 3 steps because we went into a lot of detail for those. the smoothing step, that's where we're developing our surrogate functions. So that's where we're converting our discrete data points into continuous functions. And then we're going to extract our shape components. And that's where we're going to do that principal component type analysis for dimension reduction. And then ultimately, we want to model that back to our DOE factors that we have. So for surrogate functions, this is our smoothing step where we're now converting those discrete points into continuous functions. So there were 4 different types of surrogates that we considered. We looked at B-spline, P-spline, Fourier basis, and then wavelet. So for B-spline, this is piecewise polynomials with an underlying mean model and variance components with spline coefficients. So along your time curve, you're going to select how many different knots or control points that are flexible, and that's going to be separated along your curve. P-spline is very similar to B-spline, but P now stands for penalized, and it's a penalty for the tune smoothness continuity to eliminate any problems with missing support between those different knots and neighboring elements. Neither of those we ended up using. There's a lot of work that goes into figuring out the best number of knots. For P-spline specifically, that one tended to have a lot of knots and was very slow to fit. And then we also didn't use Fourier basis. Our particular modeling and simulation that we were looking at was not really appropriate for this type of data because this is more for vibration and sound signals. So think periodic type data. So this wasn't really relevant. What we ended up leveraging was a wavelet model. It gave really good insight into the shape features of our particular data set. It didn't require knot selection like the others did. It was a very good, fast alternative. So our wavelet surrogate function, this is a screenshot on the right here of JUMP and what we ended up getting for our model. So there's 5 different types of wavelet models JUMP could select. So you can see on that screen there, the plot of our X and Y, our data. The red line there is going to be the mean. And then those black lines are essentially those 1,000 different runs that we had. And then to the right of that plot, is the various different model numbers along with the BIC there on your y-axis. JUMP go ahead and defaults to pick the best fitted model based on the lowest BIC. So it's very simple. All we had to do is really put the data in, select that we wanted a wavelet model, and then it gave us the recommended wavelet surrogate function. So we didn't have to go and pick any of the knots like we would have for the other surrogate functions. And then Catherine's now going to discuss functional principal component analysis, FPCA.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So functional principal component analysis, or FPCA, is a statistical method for investigating the dominant modes of variation in functional data. FPCA, as the name might indicate, is based on PCA, which is often used to reduce dimensionality of large data sets by transforming your set of variables into a different, smaller set of components that still contains most of the original information. PCA finds the principal components that maximize the variance of the data along with the vector direction. And each principal component explains a portion of the total variance within the data, with the first component explaining the largest amount, the second component explaining the second largest amount, and so forth. All of these build an orthogonal basis, which means that each data point is in fact a linear combination of the principal components. And so by using this subset or a subset of principal components, we can reduce the dimensionality of the data. FPCA performs very similarly to PCA with functions instead of vectors, which means our principal components are actually curves. So the next step in our process, our modeling process, was in JUMP, we performed FPCA on the surrogate, the wavelet surrogate model to extract those shape parameters and the functional principal components. You'll see in the bottom left of the diagram or the figure, there's a black diamond with a red line that allows us to toggle between the number of principal components we want to select. So we're able to quickly see how that changes the output above. and see how the number of components explains the variability in the data. We ended up selecting 3 principal components because they described over 99% of variability. And there was also a sharp drop off in the variability explained with later components. You'll see that that third one has just a little bit of variability compared to those first 2. And then also JUMP has on the right, once you've selected the number of components, you can use those sliders there to see how that changes the resultant profile of the curves. So the last step was functional DOE or FDOE. This used regression to tie in the DOE inputs directly back to the surrogate model coefficients, which at this point are FPC scores. The JUMP Functional Data Explorer again had those red lines where we could toggle back for each DOE variable to show how that variable affected the curve depending on where we were in the domain. That was really helpful to help us understand how these variables were affecting our model. After developing the surrogate model, we wanted to extract the equation, one, so we could share it with our engineers and other internal users, but also potentially share it to external users. And then secondly, we wanted to be able to explore the uncertainty in that surrogate model. JUMP is great in developing the model. It provides that functionality to create the predictive expression, but does not yet have the ability to evaluate the error or easily export the expression. So each component of the predictive expression was extracted, and we added some code to create both MATLAB and R scripts to address these needs. So the next phase in our process was to understand how the model was behaving, how well it fit. So first we used a prediction interval to identify the likely intervals where a new curve might land. And since classical methods were not feasible with the structure of the surrogate model, we used a bootstrap interval with cross-validated data. We compared both new runs of the physics-based model as well as the surrogate predictions of those new runs to validate this. And the few runs that did have excursions outside of the interval were isolated and their DOE inputs were inspected so we could better understand where in the sample space the surrogate model did not match well with the physics-based model. While the prediction intervals indicate how likely output ranges were for a run, root mean squared error, or RMSE, was used to see how error changed throughout a run. Scalar metrics were computed at each point in the domain following the example of Ramsey and Silverman, and the resulting RMSE plots helped us visually identify what portions of the domain the surrogate model had more difficulty predicting accurately. As Elizabeth mentioned before, the physics-based model has some inherent error as well. So we want to next study the aggregate error between the surrogate model and the physics-based model and the test data. So RMSE curves will be obtained for the surrogate model to the physics-based model, the surrogate model to test data, and the physics-based model to test data. And all of these curves will be compared to each other to understand how error compounds in each modeling layer. So we did a lot in this study. We performed the DOE analysis on the physics-based parameters to identify the most significant input parameters. We generated physics-based model simulations on those significant parameters. And then we leveraged JUMP's Functional Data Explorer to perform transient profile regression. This included smoothing the data with the best fitting wavelet model, performing FPCA to find those those dominant modes of variation. And then finally using FDOE to tie back those input DOE parameters to the surrogate model. We then created R and MATLAB scripts to provide predictive expressions of the physics-based model to engineers and for our error analysis, and quantified the performance of the surrogate model to the physics-based model. Next, we plan to aggregate the error, or to quantify the aggregate error for the surrogate model to the physics-based model. And that concludes the informational portion, and and I'm sure Elizabeth would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. There's no more questions. We really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.